Well, hello everyone. Thank you for having me here today. We're going to talk about the wonderful world of joint filling today and the importance.
Muchas gracias por tenerme hoy día acá y voy a hablar sobre el maravilloso mundo de los sellos de junta.
We're going to focus today more specifically on protection of joints in trafficked industrial type floors. So a lot of the same materials will be used in retail or pedestrian type floors, but today we're going to stay a little more focused on an industrial floor joint protection.
Vamos a hablar hoy día de la protección de las juntas, principalmente de los trabajos industriales y menos de los trabajos peatonales y de retail.
So in an industrial facility, the floor is the work surface for all of the operations. It's an important component of the building. The floor and the roof, very important.
En los pisos, en las operaciones industriales, lo más importante es el piso donde transitan las grúas y la superficie, la cubierta, el techo.
So the proper treatment of joints within this facility that has such a high focus on floor productivity is very important.
El principal foco en las juntas es tratarlas para tener una mayor productividad del piso.
If we don't pay special attention to the protection of these floor joints, the floor may not be an asset. It may look like this.
Si no tenemos un especial cuidado en cuidar las juntas y tratarlas bien, vamos a tener grandes problemas como se ven en la foto.
In addition to the protection of the joints, one of the things that we need to focus on as well is the traffic. As was discussed in the earlier presentations, the changes in vehicle forklift traffic from old style large rubber tires to newer style forklifts with small hard wheels and heavier loads in many cases creates further problems at the joints within the slab.
Lo que nos tenemos que fijar bien a la hora de cuidar las juntas es en el tipo de tránsito que vamos a tener y cómo ha ido cambiando, como lo han dicho expositores anteriormente, ha ido mutando de grandes ruedas más blandas a ruedas cada vez más pequeñas y más duras.
So properly jointed slabs create interruptions, just like this floor that we have here. All of these contraction joints create an interruption in the floor surface. As forklifts travel across the joints, impact occurs at the edges of the joints, which leads to deterioration. So they must be protected.
Los pisos industriales tienen interrupciones, que son las juntas de contracción, como está en el piso donde estamos hoy día en esta pieza. Son esas interrupciones las que van a dejar las aristas expuestas a dañarse si no tenemos cuidado de protegerlas.
This would be a picture of a properly filled joint with the right type of material. We'll talk a little bit about the different types of material, but a properly filled joint, finished flush, would be protected.
Esta es una foto de una instalación de relleno de juntas correcta. Tiene que estar rasante con el nivel del piso.
A joint unfilled in forklift traffic will ultimately yield problems.
Una junta sin relleno de junta con tráfico de grúas va a generar problemas como vemos en la foto.
Just to back up for a moment, there's a lot of information and process to go through, and when discussing joint filling specifically, we're not going to cover all of it today, trust me, because it would take way too long. But timing of the installation, when joints are filled, is very important. We need to accommodate slab shrinkage prior to filling the joints. Otherwise, the material will tear or the joint will break.
Es muy importante coordinar la instalación del relleno junto con la retracción del piso. Mientras antes se coloque el relleno, se va a empezar a despegar del relleno de una de las caras del corte.
Unfilled joints, 2 years later, deterioration is starting to occur.
Después de 2 años de tránsito sin relleno de juntas, empiezan las aristas del corte a dañarse.
3 years,
Después de 3 años sin relleno de juntas.
5 years.
5 años.
It's like very bad. So how fast that deterioration occurs is really a function of, well, several things, but primarily the vehicle traffic, the forklift traffic.
Cuán rápido se daña la junta principalmente va a depender de qué tipo de vehículo, qué tipo de grúa vamos a tener.
One other important factor for to determine the deterioration is when we talked earlier presentations on curl and deflection. If you have a lot of curl and deflection, and you have the small wheel, the problem is compounded. It's much more problematic, and much more deterioration will occur.
Adicional al tipo de grúa, el alabeo y la deflexión o escalonamiento de los paños va a hacer que el daño aún sea mayor.
So I mentioned earlier about changes over time in the type of forklifts that are being utilized in the facilities. Large rubber tires, very common, and still common here in Santiago, but the trend is to go to the smaller pallet rider type forklifts or the reach forklifts.
Las ruedas grandes y de goma aún son común verlas, acá en Santiago también, pero la tendencia es ir a ruedas más pequeñas y más rígidas.
This tire is approximately 80 shore A hardness. This tire, about 90 to 95 shore A hardness.
La rueda grande tiene un 80, 80?
This is 80.
Yeah.
Yeah.
80 de shore, de dureza,
80.
y la pequeña
95.
cerca de
95.
95 shore de dureza.
So with the smaller, harder compound in the wheel, in the tire, and joints that are unprotected, the deterioration happens even more accelerated.
Con ruedas más duras, la deterioración va a ser más acelerada.
So what do we do to prevent these problems of the joint deterioration?
¿Qué hacemos para resolver el problema que hemos descrito?
The standard in the industry for joint protection is to now utilize a semi-rigid joint filler.
El estándar para resolver...
To use a semi-rigid joint filler.
se usa una rigidez similar a la de las ruedas.
Yeah. The ACI standard, American Concrete Institute, in the 302 and 360, they indicate a minimum shore rate of 80 hardness for traffic floors.
El ACI recomienda como mínimo en short el 80 para los rellenos de juntas.
That standard for within ACI is fairly old. That's been in place for probably 20 years. The minimum shore rate 80. In reality, today, most joint fillers, semi-rigid joint fillers, will be much harder. Will be 90, 85 to 95.
El estándar de la ACI ya tiene 20 años desde que se definió. Hoy día los rellenos de junta van entre 85 y 95. El estándar era 80.
And the reason for that is, like I just explained, with the changes in forklift traffic to harder, smaller wheels, we as the material side have to increase the hardness of the material to provide the joint protection.
La razón de que esto esté ocurriendo en la industria es que las ruedas han ido endureciéndose aún más desde hace 20 años a la fecha, pasando ruedas de 80 hasta 95.
So this slide shows how a semi-rigid joint filler works, how they're designed to perform.
Esta diapositiva muestra cómo el relleno semirrígido trabaja.
And I'm sorry, it's not in Spanish. It was a picture and I couldn't translate it. Critical, the primary goal of a semi-rigid filler is to carry the wheel load across the joint without providing impact at the corners.
El primer objetivo es generar soporte suficiente a la rueda para que pase sobre la junta sin generar daño en las aristas.
It must have good abrasion resistance, because in a typical facility that has 25 or 50 forklifts and the repetitive traffic, the material must have a strong or a high abrasion resistance.
Como en un edificio de entre 25 y 50 grúas, el relleno de junta, el material deberá tener suficiente resistencia a la abrasión para soportar el tránsito repetitivo sobre la junta.
And then at the same time as having a high abrasion, it must also have some resiliency so that it can accommodate impacts.
Adicional a eso, deberá tener resiliencia para absorber los impactos de la rueda.
A lot of these things are difficult to achieve with traditional type of rigid repair products, rigid products. If they're rigid, they can provide protection of joint edge, but they don't have the resiliency to accommodate the movement or the impact.
Los productos rígidos tienen suficiente rigidez, dureza para resistir el tránsito de la grúa, pero no suficiente flexibilidad para absorber los movimientos de los paños de hormigón.
This material that we're talking about being semi-rigid, there are several different types of semi-rigid. It can be a semi-rigid epoxy. It can be a semi-rigid polyurea. I will not go into a great deal of detail between the two different types of material. The goal of those different types of material is to achieve the same thing, which is the edge protection. In a trafficked floor,
Hay dos tipos de materiales semirrígidos, poliurea y epóxico. Ambos cumplen el mismo objetivo. No voy a explicar detalles de cada uno de los productos, pero el objetivo es proteger las aristas del corte.
In a forklift traffic floor, this is really the critical part, is the filler depth. For a contraction joint, a socket joint, the standard for filler depth is the full depth of the cut of the socket.
Para juntas de contracción, el estándar es rellenar el corte completo de la junta.
That's not often done in the real world in a lot of places around the world. A lot of times the joint filler is a quarter of an inch.
En el mundo real es común en el mundo ver que no se cumple eso y se pone la mitad de un cuarto de pulgada del relleno de junta.
The problem is the semi-rigid fillers, they will not provide protection. They cannot do their function if they are installed less than the recommended depth of the cut. So for example, these saw cuts here are probably 2 centimeters. The joint filler needs to be 2 centimeters. 3 centimeters? Okay. I don't know how thick it is. Depth of cut dependent upon the thickness of the slab.
Por ejemplo, los cortes que hay acá eran 73 centímetros de profundidad, se debiera rellenar en la totalidad del corte.
So it all starts here, a new facility, saw cut joints, and now it's time to protect them. We'll be doing demonstrations outside today on proper joint filling. We can cover a lot of information on the process, how the materials actually work, and all those kinds of things. Appreciate you having me, and thank you very much.